All right, ready to dive in? Today we're tackling B.F. Skinner, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. It's one of those books that really got people talking.
Oh, absolutely. A real game changer.
And you know our listeners, they're fascinated by this stuff. So, freedom, dignity, how our behavior is controlled, let's unpack it.
Well, buckle up. Skinner, he comes out swinging, right? He says this idea we have, this autonomous man driven by free will, needs a serious rethink.
That's a big claim.
It is. He thinks we're so focused on like our feelings, our thoughts, all that internal stuff, but really it's the external factors, the learned responses that are driving the bus.
So are you saying we don't make our own choices?
Now, hold on. Skinner's radical behaviorism, it doesn't mean we're robots. It's more like those choices. They're shaped by our environment in ways we might not even realize.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. But, how much can our environment really influence us?
Well, remember Darwin, right? Observing the Fuegians. Those folks were practically naked in freezing temperatures.
Yeah, wild, right? You'd think they'd bundle up.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how much free will was involved there. It's like their culture, their environment, it kind of overruled their discomfort.
So when Skinner says we're controlled, he's not talking about some evil mastermind, right?
No, no, not like that. He's talking about this complex web of environmental factors, all these things that nudge us, shape us in ways we don't always see.
Okay, that's interesting. But then what about freedom? If we're so influenced, so controlled by our environment, are we really free at all?
Ah, freedom, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Skinner, he says we need to rethink what we even mean by freedom.
Rethink freedom. How do you do that?
He talks about two types of control. First, there's aversive control, like punishment. Then you've got positive reinforcement, which uses rewards.
Okay, so carrots and sticks, basically.
Right. And Skinner's point is our feeling of freedom, it often comes down to the type of control, not the absence of it.
So even when we feel free, there might be these subtle influences at play.
Think about it. Way back when, those early wage systems, it was all about the threat of punishment, right? Now it's more about rewards, getting paid for work. Feels freer, yeah. But Skinner would say even those rewards, they can be a form of control.
So like we're being manipulated by our paychecks.
Not necessarily manipulated, but influenced, definitely. Take gambling, for example. The chance of winning, that potential reward, keeps people hooked, even if they end up losing more than they win.
That makes sense. You get that rush, that feeling of possibility, and it keeps you coming back.
Right. And it's not just gambling. Think about those apps, the ones that are constantly pinning you with notifications. Are you really choosing to check them, or have they been designed to keep you hooked?
Whoa, yeah, you're right. It's like they've figured out how to tap into our reward system to keep us engaged.
You got it. Skinner wants us to see those systems, those hidden influences, and how they shape what we do. And this all ties back to his critique of dignity, too. You see, we tend to think of dignity as this internal thing, this virtue, but Skinner says it's more complicated than that.
So if it's not about some inner quality, where does our sense of worth come from?
Well, Skinner, he says we're drawn to actions that seem to defy explanation, things that we can't easily explain. Picture a soldier risking their life in battle. We call it bravery, a noble act of free will. Or think about someone overcoming incredible odds. We call it a miracle.
But Skinner would say there are always reasons, always environmental factors behind these actions.
He would argue that understanding behavior from a scientific perspective can actually demystify those actions. It doesn't mean they're any less impressive, it just gives us a different lens to view them through.
So it's not that we're just product of our environment with no internal drive at all.
Right. Skinner, he's not denying our biology. We're born with certain tendencies, sure, but it's our experiences, our environment that shape how those tendencies actually play out.
It's like nature and nurture all mixed up together.
Exactly. It's this intricate dance between our biology and our experiences that makes us who we are.
That's fascinating. But, okay, so if we're not supposed to use punishment to control behavior, what does Skinner suggest we do instead? How do we deal with those undesirable actions, the ones we want to change?
Now, that's where things get really interesting. Skinner, he wasn't a fan of punishment. He thought it was ineffective, and often it just caused him more problems. He was all about a more nuanced approach, one that focuses on understanding behavior and using positive reinforcement to shape it.
So basically, reward the good, ignore the bad.
Well, it's a bit more complex than that. Skinner actually outlines a few different ways to approach this, and, they each come with their own set of challenges. So one approach Skinner talks about, it might surprise you, it's permissiveness.
Permissiveness. You mean just letting people do whatever they want. How does that work?
Well, think of it as like creating this illusion of freedom. You remove all the rules, all the constraints, and it seems like people are totally autonomous, right? But remember, those subtle environmental factors, they're still at play, even when we don't see them.
So even if you give someone complete freedom, they're still being shaped by their environment.
Right. It's like, those choose your own adventure books. You think you're making all the decisions, but the author's still setting the stage, guiding the possibilities.
Okay, I see what you mean. But I guess the question is that true freedom?
Exactly. And Skinner, he would argue true freedom comes from understanding those influences, those environmental factors, and then consciously designing environments that support our goals and values.
So it's not just about removing all constraints. It's about being intentional about the environments we create.
You got it. So permissiveness, it's one approach. But Skinner, he goes deeper. He talks about this idea of midwifery. It's like borrowing from Socrates, that whole intellectual childbirth thing.
Oh yeah, the idea that teaching is about helping people discover what they already know.
Right. So the skilled midwife or teacher, they guide the learner, they help them uncover knowledge that's supposedly already inside them.
Sounds pretty empowering, right? Like you're not really teaching them anything new, you're just helping them access their own potential.
It can be, but see, the control, it's just more subtle. The midwife, the teacher, they're using these carefully crafted questions, these prompts, to nudge the learner toward a specific conclusion.
So the control is still there, it's just disguised as helpful guidance. It's like you think you're freely exploring, but you're actually being led down a specific path.
Exactly. It's like a magician, right? You think you're seeing one thing, but there's this whole sleight of hand thing happening behind the scenes. And Skinner, he talks about guidance too. He uses this metaphor of like a gardener tending a plant.
Okay, I can see where this is going. You think you're just nurturing natural growth, but really you're shaping the plant's development.
Right, you decide how much water it gets, how much sunlight, how you prune it. All these choices, they influence how the plant grows. And often, we're not even fully aware of the extent to which we're controlling the outcome.
So it's like, even with the best intentions, we're still shaping the environment, and in turn, shaping the behavior of others.
That's Skinner's point. We need to be mindful of that influence, even when we think we're just helping. He wasn't saying that guidance is bad, per se, but that we need to be aware of its power, its potential to shape those around us.
It makes you think about, like, parenting, You want to give your kids freedom, but you also want to guide them, help them become responsible adults. It's tricky.
It is, and it highlights how important it is to be conscious of the environments we create, the impact they have on those around us. Skinner, he wasn't just about criticizing what's wrong, he was also really passionate about designing better systems.
Okay, so we've talked about these alternatives to punishment, but how do we actually move forward? I mean, how do we get from criticizing what's broken to building a better world?
Well, Skinner, he believed in design, consciously shaping environments to get the outcomes we want. And that means really understanding reinforcement, how it works, how we can use it, both personally and on a larger scale.
So back to positive reinforcement. Can you give me some concrete examples of how that might play out in the real world?
Sure, let's take education, for example. Instead of focusing so much on grades and tests, which can feel kind of punitive, right? What if we designed learning environments that really tap into that intrinsic motivation, that natural love of learning?
Sounds great, but how do you actually do that? I mean, how do you design an environment that fosters that kind of engagement?
It's not easy. It requires us to really understand how people learn, what motivates them. We could use things like unification, personalized learning plans, collaborative projects, things that spark curiosity, that make learning fun and rewarding in itself.
So it's about shifting the focus from external rewards, like good grades, to internal rewards, like the satisfaction of mastering something new.
Exactly. And this idea, it applies to so many areas of life. The workplace, our communities. Imagine workplaces that are designed to promote teamwork, creativity, a sense of purpose. Communities that foster connection, belonging, that make people feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves.
This is starting to sound a bit utopian. Are we talking about designing a perfect society here?
Well, maybe not perfect, but definitely a society that's more in line with our values, our hopes for the future. Skinner, he believed that if we understand how behavior works, we can create a world that's more humane, more just, more fulfilling for everyone.
So if we're not these autonomous beings we thought we were, what does that mean for our understanding of, well, what it means to be human? What is man, according to Skinner?
That's a great question. For Skinner, understanding humanity, it's all about understanding that interplay between organism and environment. It's not about denying our individuality. It's about recognizing that our individuality, it's shaped by this unique combination of genetics and experiences.
So we're not just blank slates at birth, but we're also not fully formed. Our environment, it plays a huge role in who we become.
Exactly. And here's the key. We're not just passive observers in this process, right? We're active participants. We're constantly shaping our environments and, in turn, shaping ourselves.
So it's like a two-way street. The environment shapes us, but we also have the power to shape the environment. That's actually pretty empowering.
It is, and it leads to this really important question. If we acknowledge the power of environment, what responsibility do we have to design a better one?
Wow. That's a big question. I mean, we're not just talking about individual behavior anymore. We're talking about the very fabric of society.
Exactly. Skinner, he saw culture as an experiment, a system that we can analyze and improve. He believed that if we understand how behavior works, we can design a culture that promotes well-being, cooperation, ultimately, survival.
But who gets to decide what a better culture looks like? Whose values are we using to guide that design process?
Ah, now you're getting to the heart of it. That's a crucial question, and one that leads to some, well, potentially controversial aspects of Skinner's work.
Okay, let's hear it. What's so controversial?
Well, Skinner, he believed that science, a scientific understanding of behavior, should be our guide in designing our culture.
So he's not just talking about individual behavior change. He's talking about using science to engineer society as a whole.
What? In a way, yes. He argued that we need to move beyond those traditional ideas of good and bad, right? And focus of what actually promotes the survival and flourishing of the culture as a whole. He even came up with this concept of the good of the culture as like a guiding principle.
The good of the culture. That's a pretty loaded term. I mean, who gets to decide what's good for everyone? Doesn't that open the door to all sorts of potential abuses?
It's a valid concern, absolutely. And Skinner, he recognized that. He believed that any scientifically designed culture, it needed to be transparent, accountable. He envisioned a society where, yeah, experts in behavior would play a role, but with safeguards to prevent tyranny.
So it's not about some elite group dictating what's best for everyone. It's about using scientific knowledge to create a more just and equitable society.
That's the idea, at least. But there are definitely questions, right, about how to actually implement that vision in a way that respects individual freedom and autonomy.
This is a lot to think about. It's exciting to imagine a world where we can use science to solve social problems, to create a better future, but it's also a bit daunting to think about the potential pitfalls of such a grand experiment.
It is. Skinner's work, it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about the world we live in. It challenges those deep-seated beliefs we have about free will, about dignity, about the nature of progress.
It's definitely given me a lot to chew on. So where do we go from here? What are the practical implications of all this?
Well, that's the question of the ages, isn't it? And one that we'll be exploring in our next segment.
All right, so we've talked about how powerful our environment can be. But I don't know, there's a part of me that's a little, well, uneasy. Like, doesn't this take things too far? I mean, some people might say Skinner's view is kind of, I don't know, dehumanizing.
Yeah, that's a common reaction. People worry that if it's all just like learned responses, then where's the room for, I don't know, agency, creativity, even our souls, right? But Skinner, he'd say, understanding behavior, it doesn't diminish us, it just clarifies things.
So we're not puppets, just, well, puppets with really complex strings.
Exactly. And once we see those strings, those environmental influences, then we can start making more informed choices about the environments we create, the behaviors we want to encourage in ourselves and others.
But isn't that starting to sound a bit like, I don't know, social engineering? Like we're all just being manipulated.
I get that. It's a valid concern. And Skinner, he knew that. He emphasized ethics a lot. He said, the best protection against tyranny, it's an informed and engaged public.
So it's not about some elite group calling all the shots. It's about giving people the knowledge to shape their own world.
Right. Skinner believed understanding behavior, it could be liberating, not oppressive, like a way to break free from those harmful patterns to build environments that help us grow.
Okay, I'm with you on that. But even if we could all agree on what a good environment is, getting there, changing behaviors, changing systems, it's tough.
No argument there. Skinner, he was optimistic but practical too. He said change, it happens in steps, you know? You experiment, you observe, you learn. He was all about small-scale experiments, testing new ways of structuring things and seeing what works.
So it's about applying a scientific mindset to social change.
Exactly. Move past ideology, get some evidence, design better systems for education, for work, for our communities.
This is pretty ambitious stuff, but I keep coming back to, what about individual choice? If environment's so powerful, do we even have control over our own lives?
Skinner'd say we do, but it's different than we usually think. Not about willpower forcing things, but understanding the forces at play and using that knowledge to design environments that support us, that align with our values.
So it's like we're playing a game, right? We didn't make the rules, but once we understand them, we can play better.
That's a great analogy. Skinner, in the end, he's calling us to action, to take responsibility not just for our own behavior, but for the environments we create, to use what we know to build a better world.
Well, there you have it, folks, a deep dive into B.F. Skinner and Beyond Freedom and Dignity. It's a book that makes you question everything you thought you knew about human nature, and it gives us a whole new way to think about social change. Definitely a lot to ponder.
No doubt about it. It's a book that sparks those big questions about freedom, responsibility, the power of science. And those conversations, they're going to keep going long after we're done here.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. And until next time, keep diving deep. 69.